All right, I got 5:30. Let's go ahead and get started. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dieter Borman with Central Plateau Cleanup Company. Thanks for joining us for tonight's public meeting. Just for full disclosure, the meeting is being recorded and transcribed and will be posted on the Hanford.gov events calendar. Great to see everyone in person, and to our online participants, welcome to you as well. Just a quick logistics safety check before we get going. Just please note the exit closest to you in the event that we have to vacate the premises quickly. Don't anticipate that. I would not also recommend going through this screen here, although there is an exit here, but out the door to the left is the quickest way to get out of here. Down the corridor all the way to your right, you'll find the restrooms there if you need to leave. So without further ado, let's just jump in to the meeting. Tonight's meeting is on proposed changes to the Hanford Federal Facility Agreement and Consent Order. To most of us, that is known as the Tri-Party Agreement, or the TPA. The TPA is a legally binding agreement that has been guiding Hanford cleanup decisions for more than 35 years. The TPA agencies, and those are the agencies that are leading the Hanford cleanup effort, and that's the U.S. Department of Energy, the site owner, and the site regulators, the Washington Department of Ecology, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The agencies are proposing replacing some current cleanup milestones in the TPA with a new series of milestones that collectively address the cleanup of soil, groundwater, and legacy facilities at the Hanford site. The new proposed milestones will be implemented using an adaptive approach. This adaptive approach includes regularly evaluating and prioritizing site activities, which improves communication and allows for a more nimble, efficient, and effective cleanup process. So to explain what all that means, what those proposed milestone changes look like, what the implementation approach looks like, we have representatives here from Department of Energy, Ecology, and EPA to discuss all this in more detail and answer any questions you may have. So we'd like to introduce our panel. We will start with a presentation from Jason Capron from the U.S. Department of Energy. Following Jason's presentation, we'll hear from John Temple with Ecology and Andy McCarthy with EPA. After we hear from our panelists, the remainder of our hour here will be dedicated to questions. I also wanted to note that this meeting is part of a public comment period on the proposed changes. The comment period began on December 10th and will run through February 8th. While the agencies are not taking formal public comment at this meeting, we do hope that the discussion helps inform any comments you may want us to make before the end of the comment period on February 8th. And just before we get started, I want to go real quick, especially for our online participants. Colleen Drinker is monitoring the chat, and we will hear from her when we get to the Q&A. And I'll explain the process after we get finished with the presentation. So without further ado, Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Dieter. So before I get started, I'll give introductions again real quick. My name is Jason Capron. I work with the Department of Energy here in the Hanford office. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor for River and Plateau. And before I get going with the presentation, I do want to give my co-panelists here an opportunity to introduce themselves.
My name is Andy McCartney, and I am with the EPA. I'm a project manager in our local Hanford office. I've been there for 5 years, and I've been working with the Hanford site for 10 years.
Perfect. Good evening, I'm John Temple. I'm with Ecology's Nuclear Waste Program. I'm the Waste Management Section Manager there. I've been with the Nuclear Waste Program for 11 years and about 2 years in this position.
Thanks, John. Okay, well, again, thank you all for attending tonight. I do appreciate your interest in the topic. I will go through a presentation and some overview, and then look forward to mostly getting questions from you all at the end. So let's start with it. So again, as Dieter alluded to, we are proposing changes to the Tri-Party Agreement. And what we're proposing is to replace some milestones with another series of milestones. This will take effect this year. These milestones begin this year. This is a now change. Milestones are important to the tri-party agencies because they're one of the tools we use to define shared priorities, that we use to measure progress, and we ultimately have legal meaning under the tri-party agreement. These milestones that I'm talking about tonight address soil, the cleanup of soil, groundwater, and facilities throughout the Hanford site. What they don't address is tank farms. So, and it kind of, for those of you who work with Hanford, think of it as almost everything but tank farms is really what the scope of these milestones is. Go ahead to the next one for me. So quick orientation for those of you who may not be familiar with Hanford. So there in the inset, Hanford's located in south central Washington state, and it's located just north of the city of Richland. So for those of us sitting here in the library tonight, we're kind of down there near the bottom edge of the map, and then the site spreading up there to the north of it. So you may notice one thing about this site or about this map, and there's not column labels for that. That's because I really want to emphasize that the scope of these milestones really is the entirety of the Hanford site. Again, I could exclude tank farms on here, but at this scale, the tank farms would be a very small dot. So please understand that it's really covering that entire swath of area where we're doing cleanup. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about two concepts that I'll talk about geographically. Those of us that work with the Hanford cleanup regularly tend to refer to the river corridor and the central plateau. You're going to hear those concepts in this presentation. So the river corridor is the area along the Columbia River in Hanford. The area just follows along the stretch of the river. Historically, this is where the production reactors were located, where fuel production was performed, where a lot of cleanup work has been done. We just refer to that generally as the river corridor. Stepping in from the river corridor, the more inland area, we call the central plateau. Sitting in the middle of the central plateau, or approximate middle of the central plateau, was where a lot of the processing facilities are. Once fuel was irradiated, that's where they did further processing and extraction of elements, central plateau. So those are those two concepts at a high level. For seeing people here in the audience who also may have been involved with the 2022 Central Plateau or 2022 adaptive milestone discussion, you may be thinking, all right, adaptive milestones, haven't we heard about this before? One thing I'm going to take the opportunity here is that in 2022, when we're talking adaptive, we really was a Central Plateau focus. One difference I want you guys to be aware of right off the bat is that really the focus of where adaptive is gotten, it's bigger, it's looking at the whole picture. So that's one nuance to be aware of as we're talking on this. Next one. So there's a couple of components to what we're proposing here, but at the top level, what it has is an actual framework for the adaptive milestone process. There are specific milestones that are being proposed that enshrine an adaptive milestone process into this. And so I want to touch on that part of it first. So first, what is adaptive milestones? Easy logical question. What's that mean? The adaptive milestone process is a process whereby we as the tri-party agencies can progressively set near-term milestones and keep moving forward on near-term milestones while also keeping an eye on planning and discussions for the longer-term, bigger picture. So it's a process to be able to be responsive. The nature of the cleanup we do inherently, it's built into the regulations, it's built into the way we want to work that allows us to adapt to conditions. We're simply setting up the milestone structure to be able to support that to be responsive. The way we're doing that in milestone spaces, there's a couple of milestones in here that are recurring milestones, but they come in a couple of forms. One set of them is about annual meetings. We as the tri-party agencies are going to be meeting every year, and we're going to be talking about where are we? Where are our shared priorities? What are we trying to accomplish? Where has the progress so far gotten to? And we'll be looking and doing updates based on that. When we do those annual meetings, we're going to be looking at approximately a 10-year planning window. We will set milestones on an approximately 5-year window. The idea of having your headlights further in sight, but set your milestones on those things that are more tangible, achievable goals would be where we're putting the milestones where we define shared priorities. But we don't want to lose sight about what are those things that are beyond 10 years that influence us, that may be relevant to consider. We don't want to always burden the annual meetings with having to do a rehash of some of those things that simply are bigger picture, longer running items, but we want to be sure we don't lose sight of them. That is the purpose of the 5-year meetings. So every 5 years, we're going to meet and we're going to talk about the kind of things that we're looking at that may influence, that may affect it. Be sure we keep some planning for that. Those 5-year meetings are intentionally sequenced to be before the corresponding annual meeting so that we can use the 5-year meetings to inform the next annual meeting. That's how we're going to iterate that we keep an eye on the big picture, longer term, while still progressing with annual planning. So here on the next slide, I'll try and show that another way. So again, this is just a pictograph of what I was describing. So 2026, here we are now. The first annual meeting would occur next year. We literally kick it off in the January timeframe next year. We have a few months for planning. We iterate that year over year over year. We just keep doing that. The first of the 5-year meetings would be in 2030. So right now, we've actually already spent a lot of time talking about the long-term planning. We're in a pretty good picture. So we're looking forward to 2030 as the next 5-year planning step. We're going to keep iterating that on that same cadence. Hopefully this just showed that it's kind of that routine cadence. Until right now, our planning is, you see this 2090 date. Where does 2090 come from? 2090 is our current planning. Those, and I see several of you who work with Hanford stuff closely are familiar with things like our life cycle report. 2090 is based on our current life cycle planning. This is where B is DOE looks and says, what are all the things we have to do? What's our funding expectations? How do we do that? Right now, that's aligned to 2090. So what all we're doing with these milestone picture is aligning it to our current planning basis. So that's the relevance of that 2090 piece in here. But we're just going to keep doing this annual process where we look at it, we update it, we check back with the bigger picture. You'll also see that there's a recognition here of, while I told you we're already dealing with a lot of scope, there's interface points. We have to think of things like, what about the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico potentially reaching closure? Where are tin farms at with some of their planning activities? We're going to keep those conversations going, and that absolutely feeds into both elements of it. Again, where things tend to be bigger picture, longer term, that's probably more a component of the 5-year meetings, but anything that's within that 10-year headlights, that's part of a parallel discussion. We recognize that there's other milestone structures and pieces that tie in with this. We're going to keep those conversations going as part of this too. Next one. So for those of you that may be looking at hard copy, please be aware that this is an animated slide and it may look kind of weird if you're looking at the final result in the animated, also maybe not that helpful after the fact, but this, I want to talk to you from a conceptual standpoint, what the adaptive process looks like, just so you understand it. So we do have some specific milestones proposed. I'll get into those in the later part of the presentation. This is just a conceptual structure that right now, here we sit in 2026, and we have about 5 years worth of milestones proposed, set in different years. What we're going to do is, so as we then get through 2026, as we get into 2027, as we get into 2027, the 2026 milestones will have been completed, and we can look back on that. And then we as the agencies can say, hey, what new information emerged? Did we discover something that we should realign to? Did we have an efficiency that gives us an opportunity to pull something forward? Did we have a setback that we need to react to? Gives us that ability to either, if we need to update milestones, to confirm alignment with the milestones we already have set, and to propose new milestones. You'll also see there in 2027 that a new milestone came in 2031 because we're now looking at that additional year coming in. The purpose though, and then the same thing as you get into 2028, same concept. You see that the 2027 milestones are completed. We start to set milestones in 2032. The point I do want to impress on everyone is this is not about just always setting milestones in the 5th year. It's not just about adding year number 5. It's always about looking at the entire 5-year window and how we're doing on progress so that we can react. The biggest thing we want as tri-parties is to be able to be adaptive. Where change conditions are there, we want to recognize them, we want to discuss them as parties, and we want to be able to respond to it. We have always worked as tri-parties on those kind of changes and project impacts. The real difference here is that by talking about it as a program level, it's kind of easy to, in a vacuum, to rob Peter to pay Paul. You know, when one project has an impact, you say, well, what can we do there to do this and this? And say, well, I guess we can change this, but not think about corresponding impacts. We're working through the adaptive process. We can say, okay, if we respond to that change here, what other changes does this potentially impact? Are we really keeping our eye on the bigger picture? So that's really the intent of that structurally. So hopefully that makes some sense from a structure, and then I'll talk about the specific milestones here shortly. Go ahead for me. So to talk about the scope of milestones before I get into the nitty gritty, for those of you that aren't familiar with the process, it's important that I cover this part of the process. This is really what it's about. What's up here is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA, or Superfund process. This is a process that's prescribed at a national level. This is not specific to Hanford, but it is absolutely a core part of our cleanup regulations under the tri-party agreement. So I'm going to describe this process a little bit so you understand what we're doing under the milestone series. This process starts with characterization. Characterization is about going out and understanding the nature and extent of contaminants at a site and understanding what risks those represent, how those contaminants may migrate, what may happen with them, and then assessing what does that mean. Saying, okay, given those contaminants and those risks that they represent, what are our possible options to do with it? How might we address those contaminants? How might we do cleanup? We go through a series of evaluations and look at, well, here's the options for cleanup. Let's evaluate and look at them. In document space shown down below, this starts with a remedial investigation feasibility work plan. That work plan is the guiding document for how we as the tri-party agencies execute that part of the work. It describes what we're doing. That's what we follow as we do it. It's the plan, it's our rule book. As we come to the tail end of the process, we have an actual remedial investigation feasibility study report. This says, hey, this is the contaminants that were out here. This is how they come to reside in the environment. This is how they could migrate in the future. And this is what we think we could do about it. It ultimately then wraps into a proposed plan. The purpose of a proposed plan is to take that information specifically to come back to you, the public, and say at a summary level, this is what's going on. This is what we've looked at doing about it. And here's what we as the tri-party agencies think we should do about it. Public participation is a very key component there. That's specifically where the public can weigh in. It's considered as part of the factors that we ultimately move into the blue part of this process where we say, okay, we've looked at what we could do. We've looked at what we think we should do. We've considered input from other parties. Here's what we're going to do. And this is where the cleanup decision gets documented in a record of decision. Once we have a record of decision, we move into the yellow part of the process, which is more the rubber meets the road. Now cleanup's happening. So that starts with the remedial design step. As part of remedial design, we develop a remedial. Remedial action. Remedial action.
Can you pause for just a minute? We lost a connection. Looks like it's. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Working good? Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna wind back just a sec because I recognize I was losing sound a little bit there for some of the online participants. So starting at the yellow step, once we have a record of decision, we proceed with developing a remedial design, remedial action work plan, which defines how we will do the cleanup. Once we have that remedial design, remedial action work plan in hand, we then go forward into the actual cleanup. This is whatever that process may be for doing the cleanup, the contaminant we need to address, which could be a really big range of options. And then we move into construction completion, which is really about verifying and documenting work that has been done. Now, this graphic is from a national level, but certainly there are other parts of the Superfund process that come after this. And you see them on their post-construction completion and national priority list deletion. That's really beyond the scope of M100. The milestone series that we're proposing really gets through that construction completion component. So from a process-wise, that's the scope of this milestone. But now take that and add the other dimension that these milestones and that scope is applicable to all of the contaminated soil, all of the contaminated groundwater, and associated facilities out on the Hanford site. So it's this process applied many, many times. And for different parts of Hanford or at different parts of this process. Recognize that cleanup has been happening in Hanford for decades, and so some of this has already been accomplished. Others of this is comparatively early in the process. I don't want to get into too much of the weedy details, but to give you a general sense, I talked about the river corridor and the Central Plateau. Generally speaking, the river corridor is more in the yellow part of this process. There's been cleanup ongoing. It's mostly in the later parts of cleanup or even has completed cleanup. That's more where the river corridor is. Whereas the Central Plateau tends to be more at the earlier and the purple and blue part of the process. We've done a lot of characterization work out the Central Plateau. That's not to say we don't understand the problem, but there's still work to be done to assess what we should do about it, to look at options, to verify assumptions. So just understand that as I kind of talk river corridor and Central Plateau, the process, but this is milestone scope addresses all of it. I also want to use this graphic to loop back on a point. I said I'm replacing some milestones at the beginning. I didn't really bother to explain what I'm replacing because this graphic doesn't guess. So the milestones we're replacing are M15, 16, and 85 primarily. M15 has always been about the purple parts of this process. M16 is about the yellow parts of this process. And M85 is actually about both the purple and the yellow parts, just for a different set of waste sites. Sound confusing? Because it is. And that's what we're doing is we've seen the administrative distinction between those three milestones causes unnecessary friction. We're bringing all of that scope into one milestone series as M100. This lets us, the agencies who always recognize that that the CERCLA process has interchange and interaction between it, and things like funding and resources use the same people. This lets us manage it more programmatically rather than, oh, that's an M15 milestone. Oh, that's an M16 milestone. This just brings it all under the umbrella. Really the same scope, just rolled into a different format. Okay, let's go ahead on to the next one. So now let's get into the meat and potatoes of what we are specifically proposing with these milestones. So again, first top level milestones were about process. As I talked to you, the general scope, so focusing on the next 5 years, what are we looking at doing? So two general concepts before I get into more details. One, we're looking at continuing river corridor cleanup. I just told you on the previous slide that river corridor is generally in the cleanup stage. They're in that yellow stage. What we're looking at is, but there is still active remediation to be completed. We're looking at bringing that to completion. How do we keep that moving forward? Because that's important for protection of human health and the environment. We need to finalize some cleanup decisions that still need to be made in the river corridor. And we also need to look at future planning. There's some really key projects that are left to complete in the river corridor. While we've done some really good work, there's several really key, really big projects left to go, and planning and executing those correctly is really important. And I'm going to allude to those now because one of them is pictured here on the slide. That's the 324 building pictured on the slide. So the 324 building and the contaminated soil underneath it is a very large scale major project that still needs to be completed in the river corridor. The other two that need to be completed are the 100K area, where we're still working to finish interim safe storage around the K West reactor and finish cleaning up waste sites in K. And the third one is the 61811 burial ground, large burial ground located out by Energy Northwest. There's other projects remaining in the river corridor, but those are three really big ones that when we talk about future planning, we really have a focus on. The other thing we're looking at is collecting data to support central plateau decision making. I told you that the central plateau is generally in the earlier parts of the Superfund process. That's what we're working through, is continuing to do the data collection. We're focusing on where we can get the most bang for our buck for the data, though. We're being intentional on which operable units we focus on. An operable unit, for those of you that aren't familiar with that, haven't heard me talk before, an operable unit is really just an administrative construct. It's a way that we organize a chunk of scope within CERCLA and make decisions about similar sites or things like that. So we're being intentional and saying, hey, we want to go to the right operable units and get some work completed in order to set the stage for the future operable units. It's really a success breeds success. As we set certain milestone pieces, that lets us proceed to the next operable units. As opposed to sometimes previous process was trying to do a little bit of everything at once, and a result wasn't really accomplishing anything very well. So it's trying to move discrete pieces actually forward. Okay, next one. So I'm not going to go through these in ad nauseum detail. I'll highlight a few examples. All of these are just depictions of the specific milestones that we have to center in milestones in the scope. But before I get into even talking about these, I really want to emphasize that we as the tri-parties do work all the time without milestones. I don't need a milestone on me as DOE to go and do work. There's many other things that drive the kind of work I do. However, milestones are a place where we as the tri-parties can also align on key priorities and reflect them out there. So just because you don't see something as a milestone, don't think, oh my God, I'm not doing that work. Ask me the question and I can give you more detail on it, but recognize that the milestones aren't on every piece of scope that we're dealing with out there. Having said that, I'm going to highlight a few, just kind of select ones from each one of these so that I can maybe list a little bit of interest in why we're choosing what we're choosing. So in 2026, I'll pick the KW stack. The KW stack is a stack for the K West reactor. This is a part of tearing down the ancillary supporting facilities around that reactor, which is part of getting that reactor into the interim safe storage. Getting that stack down is very meaningful progress towards getting the interim safe storage enclosure up. It also gives us access to waste site, underlying waste sites in the area. You got to remove the building on top of it before you can get the waste site underneath. The other thing I'm going to emphasize in 2026 is 200 DV1. 200 DV1 is an operable unit. Again, one of those collections of similar waste sites. What 200 DV1 is waste sites where the contamination is deep underground and not very accessible to traditional remediation approaches like excavation and such. So at 200 DV1, because that contamination is deep underground, we've been looking at different kinds of technologies that we need to potentially develop in order to address the remediation. That is the purpose of this technology summary report. We've been doing research on that to look at what kind of technologies may be available to address this contaminant. Getting that report out is the next step in looking at what we should do with the 281 operable unit. With the 2027. So the ones I'll pick in 2027 in the sites for the group are first 100 DH groundwater. 100 DH began pump and treat remediation over 2 decades ago. And for those of you that follow the groundwater plumes, there's been a lot of reduction in the footprint of the plume, a lot of good work. We think we're getting close to the end. But when you think you're getting close to the end for pump and treat, a standard part of the process anywhere, not just at Hanford, is you do what's called a rebound study. You intentionally shut off the extraction pumps, you quit moving the water around, and you see how the system responds. Because sometimes when that system levels back off after active extraction, you learn something. That's what we're doing. We're in the process of that right now, actually at DH, but it's a process that takes a little bit of time. Obviously, as you turn off the system, it takes a little bit of time to respond. We're expecting that by 2027, we will have the actual assessments for all of the 100 DH area, which DH is the area of the top part of the Hanford, the so-called Horn area. We expect that we'll have that done, that we'll be able to have those rebound study assessments completed, which are a very important step in assessing the status of groundwater cleanup in the DH area. The other one I'm going to pick here is the planning for K area 61811 and 324 building. So I alluded earlier that there are several key projects and that those are the 3 key ones. Those projects are hundreds of $1 million projects that require years of dedicated resource to do. The last thing we want to do on any of those projects is stop. Have to be very intentional on how we do them, how they interface. They have competitions with each other. All 3 of them are important cleanup projects. All 3 of them have good reasons to be first, to be sequenced in different ways. DOE is developing the planning to look at what we think is the best way to do them in the way that's most efficient, that best executes the cleanup work that needs to be done using taxpayer dollars. This is our opportunity to propose the plan so that we can then use it in further planning with ecology and EPA. The 10-year plan, when you see 10-year on there, I know I've been around here for a while. I'm like, oh, it's a 5-year plan. It's a 10-year plan. The reason that this 10-year element is here, I want to tie you back to what I said earlier on our planning window is as we deal with the adaptive as we deal with the adaptive milestones. Remember, we're looking at a 10-year window. So the reason we picked 10 here is because that's the kind of basis we're looking at as priorities. So for me to best inform our conversations, I want to come with a plan that looks at what's it look like for the next 10 years that it best informs our strategy under the adaptive approach. Go ahead to the next one for me. So 2028, what I'm going to look at here is I'm going to go back to DH again. I told you in 2027, we will have completed a rebound study assessment. And DH, we're going to talk about, so what's it need? This is where it will be the chance for me to work with ecology, primarily the lead agency, but also EPA as the support agency to say, based on what we saw, this is what we think we should do. This is absolutely core part of the circle process. It could be that cleanup is completed in large areas and we can begin looking to moving into attainment and compliance monitoring. It could be that we need to look at some additional remediation. This is where we provide that recommendation that then also helps us define the subsequent steps we need to get to final cleanup for DH area. The other thing I'm going to touch on for this one is Purex. So Purex is actually one of the key parts of the M85 milestones. This is a large canyon facility in the Central Plateau where uranium extraction was done. Very large, complex demolition work that needs to be done. There's also a lot of soil waste sites around it. So this is the beginning of the planning for the demolition of that. Same thing, it's one more big complex project out there. We want to have the planning information so that it goes to be promising. We can work with the planning on that to be able to look at how we proceed forward with Purex demolition on the Central Plateau. Let's finally go to 29 and 30. So 29, 20, 30, we're getting further out in the 5-year window. So you're seeing a little less resolution on some of the milestones, a little bit broader. Remember that we're going to keep adding definition on those years as we progress year over year. But the things the 2 I'm going to pick here are the 2 records of decision that are here. One in the 100 N area, we expect to get to a record of decision. We've been doing a cleanup at N area under an interim record of decision. This is getting to the so-called final record of decision for N area. The other one is 200 IA1, which is a Central Plateau operable unit. This is one of the first in the sequences of getting decisions for soil waste sites on the Central Plateau. That's why we've selected that one. It's a key part of moving forward with the decisions for the Central Plateau. This one will get some later operable units that we expect to follow in the 2030s. So pretty quickly here, we'll open it up for Q&A, which I'm sure you're all really waiting for. If you want to reiterate what Peter said at the beginning, we are in the middle of a public comment period. That comment period closes on February 8th. There are our website links, as you can write these down, or you can absolutely, of course, if you go on the Hanford website or the ecology website, I think you'll find very readily. We prefer to get the comments electronically through those formats. It makes our life a little bit easier for organizing them. If you really prefer to send them in written, there's an address for it. Before I open up for Q&A, though, I do want to give a chance to my regulatory partners to kind of weigh in on this a little bit. So, John, you come first.
All right, well, I want to thank everyone that's here in person and online. So again, thank you. First off, Ecology appreciates the coordination with EPA, Department of Energy on this effort. We had several 3-hour plus meetings over this last year, and we would not be where we are today for the two sitting next to me. And also a special thanks to Cole, Alicia, and our backbone, Megan. With that, Ecology supports and is optimistic about how progress will be made using this approach. Hopefully, it will lead to improving the overall efficiency of workflow, sequencing, and coordination success. I don't want to get the questions here, so I'll end with that. We look forward to receiving any comments during the public comment period.
And I'll reiterate as well, the EPA also appreciates the coordination between all three agencies to arrive at the tentative agreement for these milestones to resolve what, in our opinion, has been a very long-awaited resolution for cleanup milestones for Hanford. EPA is focused on the cleanup of legacy contamination at the Hanford Superfund site. And unfortunately, the milestones that were set in the past have gradually fallen out of alignment with reality as we've formed more detailed understanding of what the cleanup would look like and what budget constraints we ran into that didn't match that and that increased scope. So many milestones, some of you may be aware, were placed in abeyance, is the term, which essentially meant we didn't have enforceable dates of any kind for a lot of the cleanup at Hanford, which is not a good position to be in. And we even began pushing up against the end dates of the major milestones. They were called, so like that M15, which encompassed all of the characterization activities, was set for 2026 for context, which is absolutely not going to happen. We wish it would, but it won't. And so we do believe that this is a better approach that requires the tri-parties to work together continually to determine shared priorities and set enforceable milestones based on those priorities. And we are looking forward to your comments on this approach and the continued involvement of all three agencies in the new process that we've proposed to reestablish enforceable cleanup milestones that incorporate that comprehensive look at the Hanford cleanup scope. So thank you.
All right, thanks to all of you for that presentation. We'll go ahead and jump into the Q&A now. Just want to remind folks that the presentation you just saw, there are copies up here at the front of the table. If you didn't grab on your way in, they're also on our Hanford.gov website. If you go to the events calendar, search for today's date, you'll have all the meeting materials, the presentation, the fact sheet. So more information there. Just a few quick ground rules before we jump into the Q&A for our online participants. If you have a question, please drop that in the chat and Colleen will read them in the order received. Or you can also ask your own question if you'd like, and just indicate that as well, please. And remember to stay on mute if you're asking a question. We're gonna go ahead and alternate in room and online for taking questions. I think we got about 30 minutes and probably can go a little bit over if needed, but yeah, Tom.
So I've got 3 questions, but I'll start with the hard one first. So I'm really appreciative of the meeting and the concept of the milestones. I really hope it works. And we make the progress over time. This is the last milestone series that's going to happen before we hand the keys over to legacy management. It's the last thing to be done on the site by cleanup. We're going to be renegotiating or not renegotiating, adapting these milestones in our great grandkids' time. What's the trigger for additional public comment periods on that?
Sure, great question, Tom. I'm glad it's actually worked well. It's- So recognize that there's several decisions within there that happen. So obviously decisions that happen under that framework, under records of decision will not have their own public comment periods. Obviously, there's going to be routine reporting on, there's already several forums where we say progress is. There's not a specific trigger for routine milestones under this, other than that you would see it as part of other routine reporting. Obviously, if we're making a change, that's what the tri-party agreement says, that any change that's potentially significant in the public interest. So the tri-parties can always choose to say, hey, this change is a little bit bigger than before, and bring out that opportunity for public comment. Or if they're hearing from the public, like, hey, collectively, this has gotten to a place where we've lost input, that option is always there under the TPA.
Said you had three, Tom. If we circle back to the other two, okay. Another question from in the room here. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Mia with Input Challenge. I have a similar question to Tom's. This feels very similar to the holistic negotiations, and my concern is that the agencies will go off and they'll make their decisions and they will have everything decided and they'll present it to the public, and the public will have no voice in that decision making. And will be closed out of that negotiation space. And I'm wondering, it's similar to Tom's in that how are you involving, drawing in the public if you're creating a new milestone or if you're doing a replaced milestone? Would that then trigger a public comment period, or is it just up to whenever you think maybe this is a significant change, we'll have it, we'll have a public comment period, a public meeting to gather input and perspective?
So no, a changed milestone, like one of the smaller level milestones in and of itself would not trigger public comment. Definitely need it. If we were seeing one that's like, this is a bigger change, that's absolutely where we look at it and coming back out onto public comment. Or if something had happened, like as part of other public comment, to say, whoa, the public was really, really interested in this particular topical area. We just went out for a record of decision. Those are the kind of things we'd look at to trigger public comment. The intent of this process is not to create an isolation from the public comment process. So it's important as members of the public that where you hear it in other forums, the more we as the tri-parties hear, I care about that thing. I don't maybe agree with that thing. That gives us the triggering ability to say, this is maybe something that we want to go out on this particular year's updates and talk with the public about. Does that help?
Yeah.
All right, let's take our first question from the chat.
Yeah, we have an online question from Simone with Columbia Riverkeeper. Her question, are impacted tribes involved in the 5-year meetings?
So we as part of even this discussion met individually with each one of the tribal technical staff, and all of us have regular relationships with tribal technical staff. We meet with them in different capacities. We did meet with the tribes. We've also offered consultation on these specific milestones. We'll look at the same thing on the 5-year checkpoints are really about looking at longer term. So really, it's not so much about that 5-year checkpoint, Simone. It's the same as me, is that if there's points where there's a bigger level of significance, we'd always obviously look back to iterate with the tribe. That's informed by the fact that we do have very regular discussions with the tribes.
Yeah, we meet with them monthly, so we'll have discussions on it.
Okay, I'll chime in with the same thing I was gonna say earlier. But yeah, so Jason pointed out as well that when we have like record of decision, right, we go out to the public and we offer consultation at that time as well. The point of the milestones is not to drive and create work. The point of the milestones are to capture and reiterate work that's already happening. And that's why we don't have milestones on everything. And so the milestones are not meant as this venue that's supposed to be changing the world of Hanford. And that's not how we looked at them in these negotiations. We looked at them as an opportunity to highlight the work that should be happening at the right times, and not so much to be reshaping the scope. That should be happening under CERCLA, under that CERCLA process. So it's really already laid out in terms of what the content this scope is. So it's, I feel like it's a little bit different than the, like the tank farm scope that is looking at how they do it. This is not so much how we do it. How we do it is CERCLA. And so that's a little bit different here.
So Simone said, thank you.
Any other questions from our? Let's go ahead and come back to the room if there are any more questions here.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks. Which one was I gonna ask next? Sorry. Oh yeah, so you're taking 3 buckets of milestones and putting them into one big bucket and pulling out as you have the scheduling and talking about money and all that stuff. Is that bucket still publicly available? The big bucket of stuff that hasn't been discussed? And as you go through the 5-year process reviews, is it possible to put sort of a rough idea of the timeline for these ones that are far out? So this is gonna be the 2050s, so we as the public and stakeholders can sort of have that on our radar.
Sure, probably the best answer for that is in the life cycle report. So because the life cycle report comes out for the public, and the life cycle report ultimately is a reflection of DOE's baseline planning. That's the kind of thing we're looking at as the parties too. Obviously, it's an iterative process. What we do informs the life cycle planning and vice versa. But the life cycle planning at a high level, Tom, like, where is this operable unit that I'm not hearing anything about? That would be the first place I'd look to.
I have to jump in my third real quick, because you set me up. So life cycle reports every 3 years. This is every 5 years. So there's only gonna be alignment every, every 5 life cycle reports or every 5 meeting. So, the next life cycle report isn't gonna reflect necessarily the long-term 5-year vision, or not 5-year vision, because that's something else, but you know what I'm saying, the 5-year look ahead. How do you square that circle?
Sure. So for me, the reality is that our baseline exists continuously. The life cycle report is you're right, that it's released to the public every 3 years. Remember, I do want to break the mentality that this is an every 5-year cycle. So we're working on this, truthfully, we're working on this regularly. Our meeting cadence is set on the annual. The focus of the 5-year meeting is really just to look at the longer, bigger things that are out there. However, our baseline isn't just updated every 2 years. I agree that for the public, that perfect sequence for the life cycle report isn't always going to happen at that cadence. So there would be times as the public, if you're looking at it a specific window, you could be looking at a life cycle report that's 2 years old. That might be all the more reason where either they say, well, we'll wait for the next one. Or if there would be a significant delta for any reason, if there had been a big change, that would be the kind of thing where we'd be specifically going out to the public to say, hey, we've done a pivot here and you guys should know about it.
Yeah, and I think part of that 5-year window that we talked about for the near-term milestones that we're setting right now comes back a little bit to the question that you just asked, because we went around a lot of like, what's the right amount of timing on this, right? And there's a balance, there's a level of detail where you actually can set dates that are going to be meaningful and you have enough information to have clarity on them. And then there's a level where it's too near and you can't actually affect budget planning or anything like that. And the DOE task orders for their contractors and all of those cycles. So you're balancing in between those two things. But we looked at for a while also at things like we have transuranic waste and circular operable units that are out in the future. And that's where Jason's talking about that'll absolutely pop up in the life cycle report if we realize we need to pull those back because something's getting out of alignment in those 5-year meetings. That's when you'd start to see those way out year shifts in the life cycle report, pulling stuff, moving it around. Because that's how you keep an eye on those bigger picture things. But if we were to sit down today, which we kind of looked at and said, can we solve that picture right now and set dates on all of them? We would be guessing on some of it. And that is just, we felt like that doesn't help anyone. It does not help our future, folks to follow us as negotiating parties in any way, shape or form to try to guess at what we think the right alignment of the entire Hanford scope would be. So we've taken some sense of reality into this, take a bit of a reality check.
No, on that, you said you can't plan for everything, like we can't map out everything. there's always gonna be variables you won't know. So like with this approach, when new information comes in, you need the ability to react to that, but still have a plan to march towards. So during one of our travel listening sessions, when we're hearing, priorities can change, but the process is very much important.
Yeah, Kristen.
DOE has an integrated priority list that gets updated every single year. And that represents DOE's priority for funding to achieve various work activities. Do you take this integrated priority list into account when you're setting new milestones? Or will you take it into account? Because that's done with a different set of players than I think play in the milestone process.
Oh, great question, Chris. There's actually a lot of overlap between the players. So the interface between the integrated priority list and the life cycle report and milestones, it is a little bit of a chicken egg, which drives the other, because the answer is it isn't one driving the other. Based on where we reach alignment is where I will set how we set our near-term priorities. I'm also going to use what I see as planning priorities to say, EPA ecology, this is where I think we need to be. It's that back and forth that helps us align on our priorities. I then use that to do things like updating the integrated priority list, which then also affects the baseline, which affects the life cycle report. So yes, the integrated priority list is important, but it is a part of the process that actually a lot of the same people are involved in, and we do have interactions with the regulators on it.
Yeah, so I was just gonna add, so the integrated priority list also covers the tank pharmacy scope, right? But as far as the scope that's under M100, this pretty much is the same players, in our management, of course, that are having those discussions on the integrated priority list, which currently captures 1 year. It looks at one specific year, right? And so our hope, maybe I'm saying the quiet part out loud or whatever, but is that for this portion of scope, all the parties will already be aligned on what that 5-year picture is supposed to look like. And that DOE's integrated priority list players that overlap will be trying to balance that same priority list that all of us have agreed to with the tank farm scope and all of the other pieces and aligning those. But they're always looking at, I think it's the 30 budget year window or whatever out. And so it's only looking at one specific year. And so really, ideally, this will replace us really having much of a role in those discussions, because right now, if we look at it, it's like, what milestones do we have? Well, that's our opinion. That's where we would like to see DOE putting the budget ideally.
One more question. In DOE's earned value management system, work is planned from the outset to the end. And your project controls folks and your financial analysts, they plan a resource loaded schedule and cost loaded schedule. And it changes year to year, but there has to be at the outset some interaction, I would think, with knowing where the milestones are. Because in that resource loaded schedule, they load milestone dates in there. And so that there has to be interaction between the project managers or project controls and financial analysts in setting the earned value system schedule and resource loaded schedule. Because that's where the budgets are driven.
Completely agree, Chris. And that's one of the challenges we have right now, and the interaction with the milestones, as Andy alluded to, having the M15 and the M16 milestones that have a date, but are in abeyance, and others we're butting up against. Do I load a compliance schedule based on achieving those milestones that are in abeyance? Do I load a milestone structure? Do I load a schedule structure that's based on what we as tri-parties have aligned on? That's really, this change helps us bring that back in correct alignment, because that's exactly what I'm seeking to do, is to have a baseline that has that resource loading that aligns with the milestone structure. So yes, that's exactly what I'm seeking to have.
I still waiting for anybody online. Feel free to jump in here, but we'll stay in the room if we don't have any more.
So the milestones that you have set in the M100 series, those you are confident that you will meet those dates for? Is that correct? And then what you talked about, Jason, of the replaced milestones, new milestones, those come later. But what you have in M100 is what you think will happen.
Yeah,
I was gonna say,
Yeah, I mean, right now we plan to meet those, but again, we'll be meeting annually. And if, priorities change, if those changes mean that we need to look at some other way, bring in a new milestone, change a milestone, we'll do that.
I'm gonna add on to that. However, if we disagree, then we can also enforce. So that annual meeting is not always probably going to be very easy because there may be times where we don't agree that those changes were necessarily, good cause for moving the milestones either or changing everything. So because these aren't like an automatically shifting milestone set, right? They are milestones with dates, just like the milestones that we've had in the past. And so when they come up, if we do renegotiate them, it is really a renegotiation and it could end again in dispute. So we don't want to be there, and the ideal way is that because we're meeting annually, that we shouldn't end up so far out of alignment. Like in the past, maybe we didn't talk on a certain project for 3 years, a milestone pops up and it's like, oh dang, that one we can't meet anymore because we have 20 other things going on. And that's kind of how it went. We characterized a bunch of waste sites and found out they were going to be much more difficult than we had expected. And, a lot of things have changed over the last couple of decades and what that picture looks like, so.
No one's gonna say, like the current M15 1685 structure, it really has projects kind of operating in a vacuum. Something may impact one project, it wasn't fully understood that it would impact another project, and maybe a funding or resource aspect. So, and kind of the main reason why a lot of milestones kind of went into abeyance too. So we're really trying to bring that up to the program level, as a whole.
all right, let's go back to our chat.
All right, we do have a question online from Dan Saris. Here's his question. When changes happen to the implementation of demolition and cleanup, and cleanup plans, when is the best place for the public to weigh in? For example, if a person were concerned about the potential for 6/18/11 cleanup to generate dust or emissions, when should they weigh in? Is it in the 2027 when there is a future adaptive milestone established? At what point should the public expect tritium to stop leaking from 6/18/11 into the area where Energy Northwest operates?
good question, Dan. So I would say weigh in any venue where you see the opportunity for it. And I'm not saying that coyly because there's several places where there could be input on something like 6/18/11. So if you see a reporting on a milestone structure that we have based on planning on 6/18/11, and you see something that doesn't make sense, that should be part of your input. If we do something like a cleanup modification to address 6/18/11 and you see something that concerns you, you should weigh in on it. So a lot of it, that first, the earlier we hear it, and there's multiple venues where we have interactions, even if it's not a specific common interaction saying, hey, this is something I'm concerned about, even just because it's not always a public comment venue, hearing from the public in venues where we share information saying that worries me, or what are you thinking about that? That gives us something to the tri-party agencies that we're sure we're considering. That also increases our awareness to something that's like, maybe we need to interact more specifically with the public on that, just hearing what your interest and concerns are.
Yeah, no, so as the EPA project manager for 6/18/11, I wanted Jason to answer that. But I agree with your answer. We want to hear it, and any of these venues are open. And any of the Hanford Advisory Board presentations also are open to the public. So we would welcome you to come to those. We've given presentations in the past on 6/18/11, may have been a little while now. But that would be a venue where we could do that. And yeah, there's lots of public meetings or more generic ones about DOE's 5-year plan. Usually they'll have a public meeting, those kind of things.
Any more online questions? Not right now. Come back to the room, Tom.
So I want to go back to this planning and visualization of what's happening in the distant future. I think that this, by putting everything in one bucket and associating rough timelines with it, there's an opportunity to use this for public engagement and education, actually making a timeline, though we know it's not enforceable. I'm not real comfortable using the life cycle report to know where things are because the life cycle report isn't real. It's an R wave of an R wave, because the funding levels in it are extremely unrealistic. So knowing I can't plan 5 years in advance for my budget, but for 50 years in advance, what the experts in the room think might be happening, that's going to be different than the life cycle. So just having that as a visual could be an opportunity for communications.
I'll always take that into account for where we can improve the visualization, the depiction. So, I mean, I don't, I say, that's certainly something we can take a look at. I agree with you. I think it's been line of it.
All right, back to our chat.
Yeah, we have a follow-up from Dan Saris. First of all, he says thank you. And then, let's see. So he said DOE updated plans to remove enhanced aquifer tube monitoring. Is that going to hamper your ability to judge the cleanup options at all? And then it looks like he has some additional. Your discussion was super helpful to hear, but I'm still struggling with the ambiguity of how these milestones will correspond to reaching the cleanup levels that people. Oh, it just moved on me. That people correspond to reaching the cleanup levels that people how are accomplished, and when changes to monitoring programs occur, how do we respond? Sorry, this is with respect to 6/18/11. Do I need to read that over or okay?
For the specific 6/18/11 aquifer tube staff, no, we do not believe that it's going to affect our monitoring capabilities. Those were already not compliant, a form of compliant monitoring already because they aren't built to the WAC codes. But as far as the specifics here, I don't want to go into too many details about that SAP revision, but feel free to send me an email if you're interested, or I'll be at the HAB farm tomorrow. If you're able to come to that, we could talk after that. But additionally, on, what's the second part? I have short-term memory.
Okay, so then
Meeting cleanup levels. So that is sort of built in terms of all the site, and, you know, when we set cleanup levels for these operable units, because that's part of the CERCLA process, that is sort of built into this milestone series in the way that can we go back to the CERCLA slide, the one with the CERCLA life? The one with the yellow and blue and purple. Yeah, so this process, when we have that yellow part, when we said that 2090 is the cleanup, that is meeting the cleanup levels in terms of all of the soil and the facilities, not necessarily the groundwater. So there's a weird nuance with groundwater and what EPA calls construction complete in the regulation, which is that our remedy is operating and functional for groundwater, which would be like we have an operating pump and treat going on. We have monitor natural attenuation happening, whatever, for groundwater. But that 2090 date is that all of the soil that is contaminated has been remediated to the cleanup levels, and that all of the facilities have been demolished without leaving behind waste sites. I'm not sure if that answers it because I couldn't quite understand the question, but hopefully.
Anybody else online right now?
no, he did say thank you, so.
We're getting close to 6:30, but want to just take one more run through. If anyone has any further questions, go ahead, Lee.
I have a question about funding, and have you, in your negotiations, did you talk about whether, or have any concern to, if it would be more difficult to advocate for funding for these projects if you don't have a milestone date to look towards?
So, great question, Mia. That was fundamentally a lot of the mentality of doing 15, 16 milestones was, if we set aggressive milestones, we'll get the funding for it. And that didn't materialize that way. That wasn't a successful model that ultimately just led to kind of attritional trade-offs, inefficient management of those milestones, because it became more about trying to hit a milestone target rather than looking at the work as a whole. So yes, that is a concern that all three of us have voiced on a level. At the end of the day, because DOE really is driving funding based on overall cleanup things, the milestones are reflecting those priorities. We have not seen that the milestones necessarily drive the funding as such. Great question.
No, I was gonna say kind of on the regulatory side, we work to ensure that DOE kind of meets their obligation to request and applying level funding for the Hanford cleanup. And, providing funding means Energy has the congressional level funding to meet their obligations under the tri-party agreement. But if Energy doesn't receive the compliant funding, N100 positions the agencies much better to really adjust priorities and to adapt to varying funding levels.
All right, let's take one more pass here. Anybody online have a question? How about in the room? We're all here. This is your time. Okay, again, thank you all for coming out. Really appreciate it coming out on a Tuesday night, and to our online participants as well. Andy, Jason, John, thank you to our panel as well. Again, this comment period continues through February 8th, so hopefully the discussion tonight has helped inform any public comments you may make on this comment period. And as Jason and our other panelists alluded to, there will be other touch points for many of these decisions down the road. So thank you again. Have a great evening.